The vibration of the steering wheel was a physical language I understood better than English. At 80 miles per hour over the jagged, sun-baked washboard trails of the California coast, the chromoly steel tube chassis of the prototype Desert Runner absorbed the brutal impact of the terrain. I kept my eyes locked on the horizon, my hands making microscopic adjustments to the wheel. The massive 40-inch tires dug into the loose sand and granite, throwing a thick rooster tail of dust into the dry afternoon air. I downshifted, the heavy transmission whining in protest, and pitched the 2-ton truck sideways into a sweeping hairpin turn bordering a sheer cliff. The rear end broke loose, floating on the edge of a drop, before the locking differentials caught traction and violently launched the vehicle forward. I hit the brakes at the designated checkpoint, the ceramic pads biting hard into the slotted rotors. The truck slid to a halt in a cloud of blinding white dust. I killed the ignition. The sudden silence ringing in the cab was deafening. The dual electric cooling fans hummed against the radiator, and the smell of hot metal, vaporized high-octane fuel, and scorched sagebrush filled the cramped space of the roll cage. I unbuckled my 5-point harness, the heavy nylon straps falling away from my chest. I pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped out onto the dirt, the coastal wind immediately hitting my sweat-soaked fire suit. The radio clipped to my chest harness cracked, spitting static. Base camp to Unit 1. Azriel, do you copy? I unclipped the mic, pressing the button with my thumb. Unit 1. Copy that on the suspension. Mateo's voice came back, sounding strained over the frequency. But we have a bigger problem. Macy took the heavy support rig up the Northridge Trail an hour ago to place the remote telemetry repeaters. She just radioed Jessa in operations. She blew a front axle on a rock step. The rig is high-centered, completely dead in the water, and the tide is starting to cut off the lower access road. You're the closest asset on the grid. My jaw tightened. Macy Watson was the lead telemetry engineer for this entire prototype division. She carried the crushing weight of the corporate investors entirely on her own shoulders. She belonged in the high-tech, climate-controlled command trailer analyzing data streams, not wrestling a 3-ton support truck up a Class 5 rock-crawling trail. Understood, I said, already climbing back into the driver's seat. I'm tracking her GPS beacon now. ETA, 15 minutes. I fired the engine. The 8-cylinder block roared to life, shaking the frame. I threw it into gear and slammed the pedal down, letting the tires chew through the dirt as I aimed the nose of the prototype toward the steep, jagged incline of the North Ridge. The terrain worsened immediately. The smooth, packed sand gave way to massive, jagged granite boulders that threatened to tear the oil pan right out of the chassis. I dropped the transfer case into low gear, crawling the machine over the rocks with deliberate, surgical precision, listening to the heavy skid plates scrape against the stone. At the top of a steep incline, overlooking the churning gray water of the Pacific Ocean, I found her. The heavy support rig was pitched at a terrifying 30-degree angle, its front right tire completely sheared off the axle housing, the raw metal resting heavily on a massive boulder. Macy was standing outside the vehicle, the coastal wind whipping her dark hair around her face. She wore heavy denim work pants and a high-visibility jacket, her boots planted firmly in the dirt. She wasn't panicking. She was holding a heavy steel pry bar, attempting to wedge it under the crushed control arm. I parked the prototype on the flat shelf of rock 20 yards away, engaging the electronic parking brake. I stepped out, grabbing my heavy canvas recovery bag from the rear rack. You're going to snap that pry bar, I called out, my voice carrying over the sound of the crashing waves below. And when it snaps, the kinetic energy is going to take your jaw off. Macy stopped pushing. She dropped the steel bar into the dirt, wiping a smear of grease across her cheek with the back of her heavy work glove. The axle housing cracked on the ascent, she said, her voice tight with frustration. I lost four-wheel drive, slid back, and the control arm caught the granite. The rig is stuck. I walked up to the damaged truck, crouching down to inspect the undercarriage. The damage was terminal for the suspension. The entire passenger side was resting dead on the rock. Why are you out here, Macy? I asked, pulling a thick synthetic kinetic recovery rope and 2 steel D-ring shackles from my bag. Mateo was supposed to plant the repeaters. Macy crossed her arms over her chest, the fabric of her jacket snapping in the wind. Marcus decided to restructure the engineering assignments this morning. He pulled Matteo off the repeaters to audit the shop inventory. If those repeaters weren't planted by noon, he was going to flag my division to the board. Marcus was the corporate PM, the one who controlled the investor reporting line, and he wanted Macy's budget and title. He didn't know how to turn a wrench, but he knew exactly how to manipulate a schedule to force a failure. "I'll handle Marcus," I stated, walking to the front of my prototype. I unspooled the heavy steel cable from the front winch. "Stand clear of the tension line." I dragged the heavy steel hook over to her wrecked rig, locating the reinforced toe point on the steel bumper. I threaded the pin of the D-ring through the eyelet, tightening it down, then backing it off a quarter turn so it wouldn't bind under extreme pressure. I walked back to my truck, grabbing the wired winch controller. "The rock is acting as an anchor," I told her, keeping my eyes on the angle of the cable. "If I pull you straight, it will rip the bumper off. I have to pull you sideways off the boulder, then drag the rig backwards." I climbed into the cab of my prototype, putting it in reverse to act as a solid anchor. I hit the button on the controller. The electric winch whined, taking up the slack. The heavy synthetic cable pulled taut, vibrating like a guitar string. I kept my foot firmly on the brake, monitoring the tension. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy support rig groaned. Metal scraped violently against granite. With a loud, heavy thud, the rig slid off the rock and slammed down into the dirt, all four wheels resting on flat ground. I spooled the cable back in, unhooked the shackles, and threw the heavy bag into the bed of my truck. She was staring at her wrecked vehicle, the tension radiating off her shoulders. "I'll have Matteo bring the flatbed up the access road from the north side," I told her. "Grab your data pad. You're riding back with me." Macy grabbed her heavy Pelican case from the cab of her ruined truck and walked over to my vehicle. She climbed into the passenger side, pulling the complex 5-point racing harness over her shoulders. "Let me check the tension," I said quietly, leaning over the center console. I checked the alignment of the heavy nylon straps, clicking the thick metal buckles into the center cam. I pulled the lower straps snug, securing her safely against the impending G-forces of the descent. It was a strictly practical action, but the proximity brought the scent of rain and cold dirt into the cab. I pulled my hands back to the steering wheel the second the latch clicked. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. I didn't answer. I put the truck in gear and started the long, brutal descent back to base camp. The main garage was a massive, corrugated steel airplane hangar sitting on the edge of the desert basin. The inside was lit by harsh industrial halogens, smelling intensely of welding gas and old motor oil. Jessa, the corporate safety and investor liaison, was standing by the main diagnostic monitors, her clipboard tucked firmly under her arm. Matteo was already waiting near the hydraulic lift. I parked the prototype over the inspection pit and killed the engine. Before either of us could unbuckle, Marcus walked out of the glass-walled office at the back of the hangar. He wore a crisp, expensive button-down shirt that looked entirely ridiculous against the backdrop of grease and dirt. He was holding a tablet, his face set in a hard line of manufactured disappointment. 3 hours, Marcus said, stopping at the edge of the inspection pit. He looked directly at Macy as she climbed out of the roll cage. "The support rig is completely unaccounted for. The telemetry network is operating at 60% capacity, and you just wasted our lead driver's track time for a rescue mission. Jessa is documenting this. It's exactly the logistical failure I warned the investors about." Jessa looked up from her clipboard. "The network is actually green." "Marcus," she corrected, her tone perfectly neutral. "The repeaters came online 10 minutes ago, but the timeline is compromised. The final run has to happen tomorrow before the storm hits." Macy stood up straight. She didn't shrink. The front axle suffered a catastrophic stress fracture due to a pre-existing flaw in the casting. It wasn't a logistical failure, Marcus. It was an equipment failure. "The board doesn't care about the difference," Marcus countered, tapping his screen aggressively. "If we don't have a flawlessly executed stress test run recorded and uploaded by tomorrow evening, they pull the funding. And I will personally recommend they dissolve your division." I stepped out of the truck, the heavy thud of my boots echoing against the concrete. I walked around the hood, placing myself squarely between Marcus and Macy. The support rig failed because you reassigned my chief mechanic to count zip ties instead of doing his morning vehicle inspections, I said, my voice a low, steady gravel. If Mateo had put that rig on the lift this morning, he would have caught the hairline fracture in the casting. You caused the failure, Marcus. Marcus shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing. You're a driver, Azriel. Stick to the steering wheel. It becomes my issue when my team is stranded on a cliff, I stated, staring him down. The telemetry repeaters are active. I checked the signal strength on my dash monitor while I was winching her out. Now get out of my garage. I have to rebuild a bypass shock before tomorrow. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, saw the absolute finality in my posture, and snapped his jaw shut. Jessa made a final note on her clipboard. You have until noon tomorrow to ping the satellite from the summit, she warned us plainly. If the data drops, Marcus signs the dissolution papers. Good luck. She turned and followed him into the office block. The hangar went quiet. Mateo silently slipped out the side door to go fetch the wrecked rig. Macy let out a long, heavy breath, leaning against the cold metal of the workbench. She looked exhausted, the lines of stress deeply etched around her eyes. You didn't have to do that, she said. He's going to put a target on your back now, too. I don't care about corporate targets, I replied, grabbing a heavy floor jack and sliding it under the rear axle of the prototype. I care about the machine, and I care about the data. I pumped the handle of the jack, lifting the rear tire off the ground. I grabbed an impact wrench and started removing the heavy lug nuts. Azriel, Macy said, raising her voice over the mechanical hammering. I stopped the wrench. What? Tomorrow is the final stress test on the Devil's Spine, she said, referencing the most brutal, dangerous 70-mile stretch of coastal mountain terrain on the map. Marcus had admin access to the upload portal. He couldn't change the raw data, but he could dispute or stall the packet if he saw a single anomaly remotely. He is going to try to dispute the telemetry data if there are any drops in the signal, Macy continued. The only way to ensure the data packet is perfectly clean and locked is if I monitor the main hard drive connection locally. I stared at her, the heavy tool hanging from my hand. No, I have to ride in the navigator seat, she insisted. Absolutely not, I said, dropping the wrench onto the concrete. The Devil's Spine isn't a dirt road. It's a high-speed endurance track full of blind crests, washed-out ravines, and sheer drops. The extra weight changes the suspension geometry. I'm not taking you down a cliff with me. I weigh 130 pounds, Macy countered, her voice rising with professional authority. You can adjust the coilover preload to compensate. If I am not in that cab, monitoring the raw feed, Marcus will find a way to corrupt the upload. I am riding with you. I kept rechecking the harness latch with my thumb until it clicked twice, then a third time like the sound could guarantee nothing would go wrong. I liked the cab empty. Empty meant 0 variables. No one to monitor except myself. I'm a lead field engineer, she continued, her voice dropping to a low, completely steady tone. I know the risks of the machine. I'm asking you to do your job, and let me do mine. I set the tool down. I turned around to face her. She was standing her ground, refusing to shrink. 6A. M, I said, my voice flat. Wear a fire suit. And don't touch the radio while I'm driving. Macy nodded once. 6A. M. She picked up her Pelican case and walked out of the garage. By 2A. M. The shocks were completely rebuilt. The preload was reset on the coilovers to account for her weight. And the suspension numbers finally matched what my gut already knew. I wiped the tools down, left a single halogen work light on in the corner of the hangar, and tried to sleep for 3 hours on a canvas cot in the back room. The next morning, the sky over the California coast was an angry, bruised gray. The heavy marine layer had pushed deep inland, bringing a thick fog and the imminent threat of severe rain. Macy arrived at the garage at exactly 5:45 a.m. She was wearing a heavy black Nomex fire suit, her dark hair tied back tightly. She carried a specialized, ruggedized laptop and a bundle of braided data cables. Jessa stepped out of the office, holding a signed clearance slip. She handed it to me through the window of the prototype. Radio check at mile 10, Jessa instructed, her clipboard held tight against her chest. Don't miss the window. I need to log your progress before Marcus tries to pull the plug early. Copy, I said, taking the slip. Mateo topped off the fuel cell. Storm warning just upgraded, he said, tapping the side of the truck. A massive low-pressure system is hitting the coast. You're going to have heavy rain and deep mud on the spine? We run it anyway, I said, checking the tire pressure, bleeding them down to 18 psi for maximum traction on wet rock. I climbed into the driver's seat. Macy climbed into the passenger side, securing her own harness. I reached over, plugging her helmet intercom cable into the dashboard comms unit. "Com check," I said, my voice feeding directly into her earpiece. "Loud and clear," she replied, her hands flying across the keyboard of her laptop, syncing the raw data feed. I fired the engine. I dropped the transmission into gear and rolled out of the hangar, pointing the nose of the prototype toward the dark silhouette of the coastal mountains. The first 20 miles were a high-speed blur. I pushed the truck hard, testing the limits of the new suspension tuning. The machine absorbed the deep washouts effortlessly. Macy sat perfectly still, her eyes locked on the scrolling lines of code. "Suspension telemetry is perfect," she reported through the intercom. The rain started exactly at mile 25. A solid, violent wall of water dropped from the sky, turning the hard-packed dirt trail into a slick river of brown mud. I engaged the four-wheel drive system. The steering became heavy, fighting the deep, water-filled ruts. "We're entering the spine," I said over the comms, my hands gripping the wheel. "Track gets narrow here. 100-foot drop on the right. Keep your RPMs up," Macy replied calmly. "I'm monitoring the wheel slip sensors. I'll dial back the torque mapping to keep you from spinning out." We hit a steep, off-camber incline completely covered in slick clay. The truck started to slide laterally toward the edge of the cliff. I countersteered, trying to find the jagged bedrock underneath the mud. Suddenly, a loud, metallic bang echoed from the front end. The steering wheel violently jerked to the left. I slammed both feet on the brake pedal. The truck slid for 10 terrifying feet before coming to a dead stop, the right front tire hovering just inches from the sheer drop-off into the misty canyon below. "Talk to me!" Macy yelled over the comms. "We lost steering," I grunted, throwing the transmission into park. "Stay in the cab." I opened the door, stepping out into the pouring rain. The mud instantly coated my boots. I walked to the front of the truck, kneeling in the freezing sludge to look under the bumper. The heavy steel tie rod had completely snapped in half. The passenger side tire was pigeon-toed outward. The truck was undrivable. I pulled myself back up, the rain soaking through my fire suit. I opened the passenger door. "Tie rod snapped," I told her, water dripping from my helmet. "We can't steer." Macy looked at the digital clock on her dashboard monitor. "It's 8 a.m. The upload window closes at noon. If we don't finish this run and transmit the data from the summit peak in 4 hours, the system locks us out." I looked at the broken steel bar, then at the heavy tool bag strapped to the rear rack. "Macy," I said over the intercom, keeping my voice level, "I need you to climb into the driver's seat. Can you hold the brake pedal completely to the floor while I get underneath?" She gave a sharp nod and quickly unbuckled, sliding over the center console. I walked to the rear of the truck, unstrapping the tool bag and a thick, yellow, heavy-duty ratchet strap. I crawled under the front of the truck, lying flat on my back in 3 inches of freezing mud. The rain battered my visor. I pulled the 2 broken halves of the thick steel tie rod together. I grabbed a heavy steel wrench handle from my bag, laying it flat across the brake like a medical splint. I threaded the heavy yellow ratchet strap around the steel components, looping it tightly, and began cranking the heavy metal ratchet mechanism. The nylon strap groaned under the immense pressure, compressing the broken steel rod against the wrench handle. I crawled out from under the truck, covered in thick brown sludge. I stood up, breathing hard. "Will it hold?" Macy asked from the open door. "It wasn't steering just a way to keep the wheel from free-floating long enough to crawl to the summit," I explained, climbing back into the driver's seat as she slid back to the passenger side. "We have 40 miles of trail left. We have to keep the speed under 20 and let the rock dictate the path." I wiped the mud off my visor. I put the truck in gear. For the next 3 hours, it was an agonizing test of endurance. I babied the steering wheel, avoiding every deep rut, feeling the terrifying looseness in the front end. Macy sat beside me, her eyes darting between her laptop screen and the trail ahead. She called out the terrain changes, using her topographical radar map to warn me of drop-offs hidden by the heavy coastal fog. "Hard left in 50 feet, she commanded, her voice steady. "The trail washes out on the right edge." I obeyed, instantly. I didn't look at the map once. I drove off her callouts like they were physical traction on the road. At exactly 11:30 a.m., the heavy clouds broke. We crawled the crippled prototype over the final rocky crest, reaching the flat summit peak of the Devil's Spine. I hit the brakes and threw the truck into park. The engine ticked, completely exhausted. Macy's hands flew across her keyboard. "Establishing connection to the satellite uplink," she reported. The progress bar on her screen illuminated. "Uploading telemetry packet. 80%. A sharp beep sounded in the cab. "Upload complete," Macy said, leaning back heavily into her seat. "Data is clean. File locked and secured on the corporate server." I let go of the steering wheel. My hands were cramping, my knuckles white inside my gloves. I looked over at her. Her fire suit was stained with dirt, her hair was a mess, and her face was pale. But her eyes were bright, fierce with victory. "You strapped a broken steering column together with a cargo strap in the middle of a mudslide," she said quietly. "It held," I said, my voice a rough rasp. Macy turned in the bucket seat to face me. "Marcus called me on the satellite phone while you were under the truck. He said the storm was too severe, and that he was formally canceling the test. He ordered me to abandon the vehicle and let the data fail." I turned my head sharply. "And you didn't tell me?" "I told him we were proceeding," Massey said, her gaze completely unwavering. "I told him the lead driver determined the vehicle was operable, and the telemetry engineer was executing the protocol. I locked his admin credentials out of the remote access node." I stared through the rain-streaked windshield. She had just staked her entire department on a ratchet strap, and my word. She tapped my glove once, then went straight back to shutting down the uplink. "Let's go home," she said. I kept the truck in low gear, taking the slow, winding coastal road down the mountain. The rain had stopped, leaving the Pacific Ocean a brilliant, fractured blue. I drove slowly, giving her the quiet time she needed, letting the hum of the engine act as a steady anchor. That evening, the heavy steel doors of the main hangar were thrown wide open to the cool coastal air. The engineering team had gathered around a makeshift folding table covered in pizza boxes. The prototype was parked on the alignment rack, caked in 50 pounds of mud, the yellow cargo strap still wrapped around the steering column like a badge of honor. Matteo walked by, holding a paper plate. He shoved a slice of pizza into my hand like a tool. "Eat. You drive better when you're not running on fumes." I took a bite, the hot cheese burning the roof of my mouth, and nodded. Jessa stood near the glass office, holding her tablet. She caught my eye and walked over. "The investors reviewed the packet," Jessa said, her professional tone finally giving way to a genuine smile. "It's flawless. The spring funding is officially secured, and the confirmation email just hit the main server." "And Marcus?" I asked. "Marcus requested a transfer to the corporate office in Chicago," Jessa replied. "He submitted the paperwork 10 minutes ago." She tapped her screen and walked back to the command desk. I stood near the rear bumper of the prototype, holding a bottle of water. Macy walked through the center of the hangar. She had changed into clean jeans and a simple gray sweater. The crew parted slightly. She walked straight past the food, directly over to where I was standing in the shadows of the machinery. She stood beside me, leaning her back against the massive rear tire of the truck. "The board asked me to formally designate a permanent lead test driver for the next 3 years of the contract," she said, her voice easily cutting through the noise of the room. Jessa printed the liability waivers. "They need a signature tonight." I stopped moving. For years, I had bounced from contract to contract, driving to escape the stillness. But standing here, smelling the motor oil and the ocean air, looking at the woman who had locked out a corporate executive while I was buried in mud, things shifted. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a black ballpoint pen. I handed it to her. "Draw up the paperwork," I said, my voice steady. "I'm staying." Macy took the pen. She looked at it, then looked back up at me with an absolute, quiet certainty. She had chosen to stay in the fight, and she had chosen me to stand beside her. "Don't disappear before you sign them, Azriel," she said softly. I'm right here, I promised. I didn't shift my weight toward the keys. I stayed planted right where the massive rear tire met the concrete. I leaned back against the cold steel of the chassis, listening to the steady hum of the cooling fans and looking at the yellow strap holding the front end together. For once, I just stood there, smelling the lingering scent of damp earth and welding gas, letting the noise of the hangar wash past me. I didn't need speeches. I needed someone who stayed when the storm hit and a plan that held. Real strength showed up as a clean upload, a working strap, and someone who didn't leave when the rain got loud. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.